I'm an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong. On behalf of the editors of the book, who are Jonathon, Simmons, Smridhi, Marwah, Lars Anderson, Sinikka, Neuhaus, and Marian, Mahat. We all just really want to thank everyone for joining today to celebrate the book and to learn more about it. So the title of this volume is Building a Better Normal, Visions of Schools of Education in a Post-Pandemic World. The book is published by Emerald and is a part of the Great Debates in Higher Education series. And then, the editors, we also just really want to thank Hong Kong U as well as Chara and Cirque for hosting us today. So I'm just going to say a couple of words to get us going here and kind of lay out the session. So Building a Better Normal, we feel, is a really highly unique and valuable book for a couple of reasons. One of the things that made it really unique in terms of putting it together was that it was developed during different phases of the pandemic, and our collaboration was entirely virtual and across global time zones. Another big piece of what makes the book quite unique is the content, and I'll get to that in a moment. But then I think what's really worth highlighting is that the book features really diverse perspectives. 32 scholars from 12 different institutions, higher education institutions, contributed to this book. The 32 contributors are also diverse in terms of our positions. So we have deans or heads of schools, we have doctoral students, and then we have faculty at many different phases throughout their career. In terms of the 12 institutions that the contributors represent, most are part of the excuse me, most are part of the Universitas 21 or the U21 consortium. And then we also have universities that are sort of in the global north and global south. We're also really happy that the volume features some underrepresented voices. We have scholars of color, we have women scholars, we have doctoral students, diversity in terms of institutional representation geographically. And so we were really excited that we were able to kind of curate this group of people together in one volume. So in terms of how the book was conceived and its structure, we really wanted to put something together that would concretely consider what we propose in the title, which is how schools of education can cultivate and build a better normal. And so the book scope, I think, was prepared and structured with that goal in mind. So the start and the end, the first and the last chapter, really kind of take on issues and opportunities in building a better normal. And then there are several cases that articulate challenges and changes in schools of education during the pandemic period. And these cases offer perspectives from the University of Connecticut, Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, the University of Johannesburg, Lund University, University of Nottingham, and the University of Melbourne. And then there's also two chapters that focus on kind of resilience, tensions, and experiences among doctoral students of education and faculty. So for today, in this particular book launch, we're going to have sharings from several chapter contributors. I mentioned the number 32, so we won't have all 32 contributors speaking, but yeah, we'll hear from several chapter authors. And so in terms of kind of having some uniformity in our sharing, we wanted to offer, generally speaking, we wanted to offer some sense for the audience of the big questions and the findings and the implications that are pertinent to the chapter. And then thereafter, we'd like to have a great dialogue with questions and kind of some back and forth from the audience. So that's the plan. I'm going to pass the time to Marian, and she's going to start us off here with the sharings. And if anyone has any questions along the way, you're welcome to save them to the end. Also, the chat is open, I believe, and if in case anyone wants to be having kind of some dialogue through the chat as well. Okay. All right. So Marian, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Priya, and thank you everybody for being here on the launch of this book published by Emerald. So chapter 1 actually sets the context for the rest of the other chapters and introduce the Universitas 21 Deans of Education Group and Forum for International Networking in Education. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my 5 minutes today. So the COVID-19 pandemic created one of the largest disruptions to human lives. At the time of writing, closures of schools, institutions, and other environments for learning have impacted more than 90% of the world's student population, approximately 1.6 billion learners in more than 200 countries. But the pandemic also occurred at a time where other global and local phenomena were taking place. For example, the riots in Hong Kong, protesting the handover of Hong Kong to China, the South African riot as a result of the imprisonment of President Jacob Zuma, the Black Lives Matter riots in the US that spread in the US and also globally, the natural disaster in Australia in the form of bushfires, droughts, cyclones, and hailstorms. And of course, who can forget the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Cumulatively, the extraordinary conditions that shaped these events disrupted almost every aspect of society, including in economic, health, social, and education. For schools of education around the world, many of the new procedures and policies were not only impacted by new ways of working in higher education, but also by new ways of working in initial teacher education, practicum planning, supporting school communities in their school closures, remote learning, teacher vaccination, and gradual returns to in-class instruction. The education sector, like any other sectors, heavily relied on the profession coming together to help, with those better prepared sharing their time and resources to help those less ready. In a similar vein, the schools of education within the Universitas 21 community of institutions came together during the pandemic to support each other during this challenging time. It is built on a collegial network of more than 2 decades, and the U21 Deans of Education Group and the Forum for International Networking in Education shared not only challenges and issues, but also compiled stories of success and best practices that have allowed them to redefine the landscape of education globally. This book is a celebration of this collegial sharing. So as Priya mentioned, the book seeks to capture the process, impact, and reflections on those decisions made by schools of education. It offers a vision for a better normal, shared by deans, academics, and graduate students in 10 schools of education within U21. And I'm going to list them all here. Lund University, Tec de Montréal, University of Auckland, University of Connecticut, University of Hong Kong, University of Johannesburg, University of Melbourne, University of Nottingham, University of Queensland, and University of California, Davis. And I'm very proud to be part of this community of scholars. The contributing authors offer a curated collection of global perspective that provides a unique interdisciplinary focus taken from real leadership situations in a period of intense adversity. Additionally, the book also provides practical and useful strategies grounded on lived experiences that will inform and inspire others as they navigate higher education and academia. As we all know, the pandemic is a generation-defining event that will echo in the actions of teachers and researchers for years, allowing us to redefine the landscape of education, not just for the moment, but for a better normal for all of our learners. This book provides a reference and a point of departure in and for the future of education. Thank you.
Thank you so much for getting us started. All right, let's dive into chapter 4. We have Nadine Petersen here from the University of Johannesburg.
Thank you so much. And I speak on behalf of the two co-authors as well, Sarah Gravett and Jacqueline Batchelor, who contributed to the chapter. I think that for us, two big questions or ideas that arose from this process of writing, but also the process of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic was, what does social justice and care actually or really mean in teacher education? These are words we often bandy about in teacher education programs, but I think it became very real for us in the pandemic and in our thinking as we moved forward. And then a second issue or a big question that came out for us was, how do we build on and take forward what we've learned during this period? I think our findings are encapsulated in the two main things we found through the research, which was that there was a need for agile and adaptive leadership. We had to radically rethink what it meant to be a leader in a higher education, in a teacher education world, but also in higher education. And those two things, both within faculties of education and within the broader university context, there were tensions constantly between what agility was, what kind of adaptability was required in such a time. And I think specifically of sometimes very bureaucratic leaders had to rethink how they had to adapt what they were doing to become more collaborative and transformative, and the other way around, strangely enough, as well. The second finding was really in thinking about what faculty needed, education faculty needed to support staff's transition to emergency remote teaching and learning. And here was also a massive rethinking about what expertise meant. Especially in teacher education, where people are professors of long standing who weren't necessarily equipped for emergency remote teaching, for the online tools that we needed, and so forth. And so therefore, when students, postgrad students and young students who were ICT specialists became teacher education teachers, there was a rethinking of what it meant to be an expert and how we could collaborate with our students and our tutors in taking things forward. And I'm going to, when I talk about the implications, I'm going to refer back to our big questions or the big ideas. So for me, when one thinks about social justice and care and what it really means, it was about rethinking the autonomy of academic staff versus quality and responsiveness to our student needs. If that meant couriering devices to students in remote areas, that was the most important thing. Flexibility about assessment dates and so forth. I think the implications are in an African context and in a South African context, I think we got a renewed understanding of the African philosophical framework of Ubuntu, which really says, I am a person because you are. I am because I share and I participate. And I am because of others. And I think the notion of Ubuntu really became very important during the pandemic in ways in which we couldn't even capture in the book, but in ways that really redefined what we do as a higher education institution and in teacher education. I think the impact of the digital divide in a country like South Africa, not only for teacher education, but for education generally. We are this year celebrating 30 years of democracy. And I think when we think about whether or not we have managed to move beyond the inequalities of apartheid, a big question in our minds is how much have we actually managed to do that? And unfortunately, the reality of living in the global south and in a developing context like South Africa means we may not have moved as far as we thought we had. And that digital divide still exists. The pandemic brought it into sharp focus. It made us reprioritize our ideas about how do we close the gap in inequity in education, but certainly inequity in the digital divide between rural and urban areas, schools, but also between the haves and the have-nots. So, you know, our populations that don't have access to these kind of things. Then the two last things is we really also had to radically rethink competitiveness versus collaboration. South African higher education systems, maybe because of the rankings, etc., we're jostling for space, and we had to rethink how we work together. And one of the innovations that came from this was our contribution as a sector to Teacher Choices in Action. I've put in the website in case anybody's interested, because we had to work together in order to find ways in which we could deal with our students' inability to do their practice teaching in schools. And another innovation or another idea was to rethink what we do, our modes of delivery, and how we operate in teacher education. And again, we came together as a sector where you have, for instance, different kinds of partnerships, funders working with implementing partners, working with higher education institutions and independent researchers in a ways that we had not thought of previously. And this is resulting in building, for instance, a new pathway for teacher education and new models for teacher education in the country. So all in all, it made us look at the two big questions. How do we build on and take forward what we've learned thus far or during the COVID period, but also in new innovations, but also what does social justice and care really look like? How do we define it in teacher education as we move forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Let's keep going here. Okay, so for chapter 5, we have Sinikka Neuhaus of Lund University here to share.
Hello, and thank you for inviting us, and very nice to share this book launch with all of you. I do this presentation, but I also co-authored. There is a co-author, Helena Berglund, that wrote this chapter together with me, and I was one of the teachers involved in this period when we had this teacher. And it could be good to know something about the Swedish context, because it differs a little bit compared to the other contexts. We only had lockdown in upper secondary and higher education, preschools, and they were open almost the whole, they were open the whole period. But for upper secondary and for higher education, the period lasted from March 2020 to June 2021. And the recommendation of switching to digital teaching, it came on a Thursday, and the next Monday everything started. So there was a lot of work when I started to teach this course, and we also had 2 cohorts of first-year teacher students. And what had to be solved, except from the digital teaching, was also that this course also includes school visits to upper secondary schools, and they couldn't be made. So what to do instead? And we had 75 students in the first cohort and 83 in the second one that choose to reflect on this switch to digital teaching and what they actually learned through that experience. And what that's the main findings is that they wrote a lot about the importance of the sense of belonging in educational setting, but also the relatedness. And you can all guess that it's the lack of belongingness and the lack of relatedness, but also how one can work when digital teaching is the main way of reaching out. As an example, the second year we started to have coffee breaks that were not mandatory. They were just free. You could come for 1 hour and sit and chat. Everyone came. So it was quite strange as a teacher to experience the longing for belonging. But also the texts that the students wrote about in both cohorts is very much around what education can be, what education is, and how education is linked very closely to some kind of community thought. The implications that we saw and what the students reflect on is the lack of motivation, but also some felt more motivated. So it's really not a black and white picture that we get hold of. Social boundaries, how do you work with that in a screen, and what's lacking? But also very, very deep worries about forming a crisis pedagogy for the future. And you have to remember that this is first-year teacher students that are writing these texts. And I'm going to quote, because I actually think that the quotations are the most interesting because they are so formulated, and everyone, you know, they came in with their papers in time. No one had to be reminded. They were really on. And I'm going to quote a student from the cohort 2020 that says, "Of course, it is not black and white. It almost never is. The digital transition enables some pupils and students to be heard while others are excluded. But I also think that we need to practice to be together, and education can be the place for this." So I would say that what the main argument could be, or the big idea or question that is formulated by so many of these students, is actually the question, what is education and what can education be? So just talking about this in this context, I would say that the advice or the sense moral is that we need to have this discussion ongoing, reconquer what can education be. So I would say to be continued. Thank you. I hope that took 5 minutes.
You were perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So now for chapter 7, we will have Jim Watterston sharing.
Okay, I've appeared. Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be able to speak to our chapter, but also to speak to the whole book. And I congratulate everyone who's contributed. And from a Universitas 21 cohort that we've become, it's great that we've found ways to work together and think about issues that cross all of our countries, and give us the opportunity to sort of share our practice with each other. So I'll just go quickly through Chapter 7, very similar to some of the things that have already been talked about. Of course, COVID affected people differently in different countries and in different parts of each country, really. And so for us, the University of Melbourne, we reside in Victoria, which is one of the 8 states and territories. And Victoria suffered more than any other place in Australia and probably most other countries. We had close to 300 lockdown days during 2020 and 21 and 22. And for that, it changed society during that period of time. And there are often aspects of COVID, I think you might have just mentioned this before, but there were some things that came out of this being locked down. Just hold on for 1 second. I've got a dog knocking everything about. Thank you. Sorry. There were some changes that provided opportunities for people who were locked down to spend more time with their children. And when we saw parks, once lockdowns were over, were full of people and changing the kind of fast-paced world that we lived in. But when it comes to education, we focused on perhaps COVID, but for us at our faculty, and I want to acknowledge my colleagues who were part of this, and I'll mention them by name: Janet Clinton, Sophie Arcudis, Lorraine Graham, Suzanne Rice, and John Quay. What came out of this for learnings for us was that COVID highlighted problems that were already there pre-COVID, and for an education faculty to be thinking about the future for students who are the next generation going forward, it became apparent to us, based on a whole range of different commissions that we undertook for different governments and different parts of the country, where we provided feedback and data about what was going on during COVID. When we came together and sat down and spoke about it, we realised that much of the challenge, or many of the challenges that were provided for us and opportunities, were already factors in education, both initial teacher education and also in teaching content, which we should have addressed earlier. And some of you talked about the digital divide. We've had laptops in Australian schools for over 20 years. And during COVID, we found that more than 25% of teachers who were trying to run online learning weren't able to do it. And that was the teachers' lack of capacity to be able to turn around and be flexible and create opportunities for all children to be involved. And then, of course, there were other opportunities that really just couldn't be fulfilled because young people didn't know how to tune in and didn't know how to use laptops themselves. So that digital divide, which we've already talked about today, and I won't go through, became very apparent to us. I guess for us, we really focused on the COVID journey and what we learned out of it. For us in particular, the Faculty of Education at the University of Melbourne, we're a graduate school. So we run a graduate program for people who've done an undergraduate degree to qualify to be teachers. And we had a cohort, it's a 2-year program where people focus on education and become credentialed to be a teacher. We had a program for 2 years where not one student was able to come to the university. So they started and completed their whole course without ever stepping foot on campus and working on Zoom and in ways that were online, but without the without the university experience. And for many of those people, that created a range of issues that we overcame, but probably not to the same level that we would have been able to do in terms of our regular program. So I guess for us, what the tension was, and I'm sure it was for everyone that's written a chapter, the tension really was, do we go back to where we were before COVID, once COVID finishes, or do we think about a new normal and look to the future instead of what previously has been happening, certainly in Australian education, where we manage our innovation by looking in the rear vision mirror. And so from our perspective, we felt that education was always running 5 to 10 years sort of in the past, as we were slowly led into innovation that took so long to inculcate. So for us, and really, it was a focus of not going back. We've really thought hard about COVID, during COVID and post-COVID, and we really want to make sure that education in Australia, but probably internationally, is about thinking, what can we do differently to make sure that the next generation is able to address the issues that confound us, and we've already heard a few of those issues mentioned today, but really about the equity and about making sure that there are opportunities to thrive going forward. And so we came up with, between us and the research that we'd been doing, as I said, for other organisations, with these 6 opportunities that we feel were highlighted by COVID, but weren't on our agenda because of COVID. And so I'll just go quickly through them because it's the context really of what this chapter is about. So we're of the belief that it showed during COVID that we really do need to rethink the purpose of schooling. You know, but 250 years ago, when we first started thinking about formalised education, it was really about making sure we prepared young people for a job. It is no longer about preparing young people for a job, and we could go into this conversation and talk about it, but I'll just highlight that this is something that we've been grappling with. What is the purpose of schooling, and how is it different to what we've been thinking about previously? And it is about a range of needs for individuals and for making sure that there's an opportunity to highlight a range of different skills and social skills, and we think differently about that purpose. The second one was rethinking the curriculum. I'm not sure about other countries, but in Australia, the Australian curriculum came into effect and being compulsory for all schools across the country in about 2009, 2010. And it's a wonderful document, but it is so dense that there is no time for anything else. And so we saw that during COVID, that there wasn't an opportunity when we were teaching online to students and also teaching our own students to think about things that mattered to them during that period of time. What could we have added to the curriculum which would have given greater connection, greater capacity to learn, and greater opportunity for people to focus on things that they want to learn about? So we've really come to some thinking post-COVID about what we need to do to personalise learning for our students in the university and for those initial teacher educators who are going to go into schools. The third thing was rethinking assessment. We were very clear during COVID that it was very hard to assess the work that young people were engaging in and that our own students were engaging in. And we really needed to think about making sure that assessment is about what matters to those people as much as what matters to getting a credential. And again, we could talk for a long time about that. The fourth was rethinking learners, and this was probably the most important agreement of the six particular transformations that we think need to happen. And it's rethinking the agency of the student, both students within the university and students that we're working with in schools. And it's very clear to us that when people were stuck at home and wanting to work, that they had their own issues that they really wanted to examine and things that they could see happening around them. And yet we didn't provide enough space for that to think about bringing that into our opportunities to teach online, and we're doing that better now as we go forward. But again, I'll leave that one. I think we've all talked about digital literacy and the pitfalls that were exposed during COVID. We've had decades to get this right, and so it's absolutely essential. It's really a fundamental as we go forward that everyone needs to be digitally literate, and it needs to work inside the school environment or the university environment and outside, and we don't have that yet. And finally, our sixth sort of transformation was that well-being is everyone's business, and education has always been about learning and ways of learning and thinking of pedagogies and the things that we've all learnt and focused on. But it became very clear well before COVID but we probably didn't see it, that during COVID, people's well-being and their capacity to interact socially and to build relationships, which is the fundamental aspect of teaching, so that we learn together and we share our understandings, it just wasn't there. And it hasn't really been part of our, as I said before, focus within our curriculum and giving young people opportunities to really be able to think that through. So I won't go through any more. I've probably taken more than my 5 minutes, but we have sort of taken the opportunity to focus on what we need to do differently, and already within our programs within the Faculty of Education, we are focusing on these 6 outcomes along with others that we've been able to ascertain during the work that we've been doing. So we're really pleased that we got the opportunity to work together on this chapter, as I'm sure others were. And the source of the book has really added to our thinking as other people have identified other issues and transformational ideas. So thank you very much for the opportunity. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dean Watterston. Okay, so actually, whilst it was unplanned, the next chapter actually really ties into those 6 themes of rethinking, particularly the last one on well-being. So kind of shifting a little bit, when I explained the scope of the book, I had mentioned that there were several kind of case studies of schools of education, which we've just heard about. And then there are 2 chapters that kind of focus more on faculty and on students. And so this chapter, chapter 9, it's titled Beyond Perseverance, Developing Academic Resilience for a Better Normal. I'm just one of many people in a part of a stellar team. Marian Mahat is one of the team members, and she's here today. And the PI of this project is Jay Reyes of the University of Southampton. The project is called Resilient Academics, and it's unique for many reasons. One of them being that we have a podcast, and I'll put the link to the podcast in the chats later. So the project, which also is funded by U21, it really kind of examines resilience among academics during the COVID-19 pandemic. In this particular chapter, we focused specifically on the resilience practices and the mobilities experiences of historically underrepresented higher education academics. Just to kind of provide a little bit more contextualization, in the first phase of this project, Marian, Jay, and other colleagues who are listed here kind of unpacked academic resilience a little bit more. And so in this chapter, when we discuss academic resilience, we're really thinking about the resilience that's situated at the intersection of mobilities and immobilities. And then in terms of underrepresented academics, I think that, you know, this really varies in terms of how that looks in people's various institutional contexts. But broadly speaking, it's those who experience systemic barriers due to race, ethnicity, gender, language, citizenship, and perhaps those immobilities. The data for the chapter came from 26 surveys and 7 one-on-one interviews of historically underrepresented academics. So in terms of the findings, when we were kind of looking at the mobilities experiences and the resilience practices, what we found was that the participants articulated challenges in the areas of teaching and health. So in terms of teaching, most of the participants identified the rapid transition to virtual teaching as a really significant and primary challenge. They described things like limited transition time, poor preparation for virtual teaching pedagogy, as well as increased workload to enact that transition and perhaps to ramp up their pedagogy. And then interestingly, another piece of this, particularly in this, I think in this second phase of the project and also second phase of the pandemic, was that participants found hybrid teaching to be particularly challenging because it required them to be fully present, both face-to-face and online. And it kind of required this really unique and perhaps cumbersome technical and pedagogical prowess. The other thing was that hybrid teaching arose, you know, I think for most participants and most institutions, kind of in, you could say, the second year or in kind of the latter phase of the pandemic. And so by then, right, the participants felt that they were particularly fatigued and stretched. And so in terms of resilience practices, what we really found was this common ethic of perseverance and grit. And so we heard a lot of things like, you know, never give up, keep on going always, you know, like a hamster who has to keep running on a wheel. And when our participants talked about grit and perseverance, when our participants characterized their thoughts about resilience, they really drew on grit and perseverance language. And so in terms of implications, in the chapter, we really wanted to focus on, especially in thinking about historically underrepresented academics in higher education and in schools of education. We focused on implications that we thought could help higher education leaders nurture resilience among faculty as they are developing faculty development plans and policies and practices. And so the three pieces that we raised were, first, we really kind of wanted to caution against grit in explicit and implicit policy, practice, and culture. And we really encourage folks to critically reflect on how grit discourses appear in oftentimes kind of sneaky ways. And I mean, we offer a lot of reasons for this, but primarily it's just that grit really operates as this kind of static perspective of academics and their work, and it really doesn't allow for multi-dimensional and intersectional structural and institutional barriers and context to surface. And these kind of grit and keeping on discourses, they sort of ascribe these labels of resilient and non-resilient, or gritty and non-gritty, based on superficial impressions of the extent to which and the efficiency with which one bounces back to their original or desired state. So this is, I think, our first implication is that we really want people to become more aware of this discourse. And then in terms of moving past it, that brings our second implication, which is we think that there is a lot of utility in using a mobilities mindset. So a mobilities lens helps higher education leadership be able, and academics who are working alongside them, be able to kind of surface these notions of kind of who's in the fast and slow lane of resilience, differences and inequities in terms of invisible labor and amounts of labor, and then also like unique institutional headwinds. And the reason why also this is really important is because this can help develop localized and contextualized conceptualizations of resilience, right? So what what might be a kind of a framework or a set of practices around resilience at Dean Petersen's institution in Johannesburg might look really different, right, from Dean Watterston's institution in Melbourne. And that's because these institutional kind of headwinds and contexts and challenges are different, and then require a lot more personalization. And so we think a mobilities mindset really helps decenter the individual. It takes like a context, it takes a more contextualized view of trauma responses, of identity, of society, and all of this can kind of contribute to a stronger framework around resilience. And then I think both of those two things together, kind of working against grit mindsets and using mobility mindsets, we see that as the basis of redefining and reconstructing, co-constructing resilience, and having these kind of crucial yet also complicated conversations around access and privilege. So yeah, so the chapter, it takes up academic resilience, and I think it highlights these really challenging areas of teaching from faculty perspective. And I think it offers some really I guess I would say inspiring and authentic quotes from scholars around how they understand resilience and kind of how they use that to do their best with the challenges that they faced. I'm going to pass it on now to Jonathon and Smridhi, who are going to share on chapter 10.
Thanks, Priya. Kia koto, everyone. My name is Smridhi Marwah, and I am from Paipapa Tomatoro, the University of Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. So as we have previously discussed, and we've heard a lot of experiences around digital education, faculty perspective, faculty student perspective, while Lars, Sinikka, Marian, Jonathon, Priya, and we were working on this book, we realized how essential it was to also have a student voice in just sharing these experiences. As we have highlighted, the graduate study is a period of significant transition in the lives of students. So through this chapter, Jonathon Simmons from the University of Connecticut and I myself, we shared our experiences from two different ends of the world and how it was to experience graduate study in this shifting environment during the pandemic. Using certain concepts as socialization, the relationship you have with your mentors, and becoming a scholar and belonging in academia. We we share our personal reflections and we take the reader to our respective journeys during the pandemic. And sort of during these journeys, we question what did we sign up for? We share a lot of uncertainties, but alongside that, we also share a lot of personal reflections of finding ourselves through the process of socialization, mentoring, and becoming a scholar in the digital sort of this ever-changing world of lockdowns opening up or again coming up, and how we were navigating through this shifting environment. Um, this, I would say, sort of an autoethnographic concepted chapter where we share our personal journeys. And through that, we try to connect it with students' experiences during the pandemic. As for my personal journey, I started my doctoral studies during the pandemic, which meant I was enrolled in the university while I was very much in my home country, which is India, and how my connection to the university and the country, Aotearoa in general, was only through my advisors and my supervisors. And I was devoid of other opportunities of socialization, which are very much there when you're on campus, whether it's events, whether it's clubs, whether it's workshops and trainings. Using that as a sort of segue to my academic ventures and journey, I take the reader through my journey of self-exploration, where I'm trying to understand what is my authorial voice, how do I form a relationship and autonomy with my supervisors, especially because I was coming to the academic journey after 5 years of being in the social development sector, which is very practical focused, and how I make that shift during the pandemic. I call it a shift from altitude to academics, and how I sort of navigate through that. Through this journey, we've realized several sort of points around, again, how pandemic changed not just relationships for doctoral students, but also for the supervisors in terms of making sure that expectations from the students are coming across well, but also how they practice kindness while the world is not same the next morning. Alongside that, we also navigate through a sense of belonging, especially when you are forming new relationships or you are continuing existing relationships via screen instead of a more sort of human face-to-face connections. Through this, we also share our journey with the U21 Forum for International Networking in Education group, and how that was our opportunity to socialize, create friendships, create sort of mentorship and guiding relationships beyond the usual challenges or beyond the usual pathways that we usually see in universities. I'll pass it over to Jonathon, who will be sharing the implications of our chapter and also his experiences during the pandemic. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathon Simmons from the University of Connecticut. Thrilled to be here. And one thing I've been thinking about this morning is I've been listening to all the chapters is like the the person I was before this whole experience couldn't imagine an event like this, where I'm sitting in my living room in Connecticut at 5 a.m, speaking to people from all across the globe in all different time zones. And I think there's something kind of beautiful about the place where the seed of this book started, where I think all of us were grappling with, like, how do we find connection, and how do we continue to learn and grow. And so there's something kind of lovely about our first conversations about this book, and could this even be something that could happen? And then now here we are celebrating the launch of this book in this truly kind of global event. So I think there's sort of a beautiful sort of journey there. Much like my co-author for this chapter, I started my graduate study the summer before the pandemic, and so I had just a brief chunk of time before everything changed. And I think one of the things that was really a challenge for me as a graduate student was, like, right at the time when I was starting to think I was figuring things out, everything shifted. And so a lot of the questions I was asking were like, what does it mean to be in the academy? What does it mean to be a professional? And all of the people that I was trying to ask those questions to were also in a space where they were like, well, I don't know what it means anymore either, because all of the things we've been doing, we can no longer continue doing, or we're figuring out new things. I think one of the things that Sam and I were very clear with about the chapter is we wanted to be vulnerable in the chapter. We wanted to share personal stories. And I think that's something that doesn't always come across in sort of academics, where we feel the need to be an expert in things, and we are experts in things. But I think even when you have a significant amount of knowledge about things, you still always have questions, and you still always have these moments where other people know different things than you do, or have different lived experiences. And I think that vulnerability is a real strength of the chapter that Sam and I put together. And that comes with one of these big implications is, for both of us, we really desired these human spaces for connection and personal relationship and personal mentorship. And I think that's something we both continue to look for as we've continued along our journey as graduate students. The pandemic allowed for this opportunity for me to define and redefine what professional means, and who I think I'm going to be in the academy. And, I think when I started, I had this vision of what my experience was going to be like, which turned out to be nothing like what my experience was actually like. And so, but at the same time, being open to these opportunities, like connecting with the U21 network, that's not something I ever would have necessarily thought about, or would have imagined that this opportunity to connect with the U21 network has turned into what it was for me, what it continues to be for me. And so I think that there's a flexibleness of thinking that I think lots of the authors have talked about here, around defining and redefining things. And along with that comes to the sort of the third implication for the chapter we put together, which is we've sort of learned to embrace uncertainty and change. And I think particularly for academics who like to have answers to things, that can be quite difficult. But it's something that we've come to say, okay, we're okay not knowing an answer right now, and we're okay with the rapid change that's going to happen, and we trust in our ability to navigate that change, and ask good questions and things like that. And so, reflecting back to where I started in 2019 and where I am today, it's not at all the journey I thought it was going to take, but it is sort of a lovely journey all in of its own. And it's brought me here to be able to share with all of you today, which is something I quite enjoy. So we were excited to be able to share a perspective of doctoral students who are just kind of starting to figure out what this whole thing might be like, which is very different than some of the other perspectives of people who've been in the academy for years. And so excited to offer that.
Thank you so much. To finish us up here today, Professor Redmond is going to share on chapter 11, Where to Now.
Hi there, I'm Bairbre Redmond, Bairbre spelt in the Irish way, which is fools a lot of people. I had the great pleasure in writing this chapter, in reading all the previous chapters before I started my own. So really, my job was to bring the book to an end, to bring together some thoughts that had arisen, but also to look at both the pandemic and the post-pandemic research that was emerging at the time. And I think the really important thing to remember, and Marian has referred to this, was the number of people that were negatively impacted by the pandemic in terms of their education. And Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General, spoke in 2022 about 6 billion people carrying an educational wounds, really, from the pandemic. And I think I'll finish on this. I'll talk a little more as I'm finishing, that this damage still lingers, and that really we have a lot of learners, both in schools and in universities, that still carry the damage of the pandemic with them. And I think that it's not like it ended in 2022 or 2023. And the thing that struck me in writing the chapter was that how integral schools of education were, how at the center of this huge international crisis, because not only were they going through the issues that a lot of schools of education, a lot of university departments and schools were going through in terms of their own teaching, that rapid move to online learning, and with all the issues that came with that, but also you were training the next generation of professionals who are going to go back into the schools and work with those children and those young learners who also are carrying this pandemic damage. So you were very uniquely central to what was happening in terms of both higher education and in terms of school education as well. In terms of the findings, I think we still don't know what we're doing with educational technology. I looked at used to be Provost of U21, and I looked at an educational innovation leaders conference we held in 2019, where in Johannesburg, where I know Thea DeVault talked about, we've been trying for the past 20 years to get it right. We've been trying for the past 20 years to get educational technology right. And hard to think that within 8 weeks of that conference, we were locked down. And suddenly, even the biggest doubters of online education were having to use online education. I think what's emerging is that some of the online education, as I think a lot of the speakers have talked about, was poor and became more pressurized for teachers as they went through the pandemic, and really wondering where we're at now, and with the added implication and the huge move of the next crisis, which is AI. And how AI is now going to impact both on learning in schools and on learning in higher education. And I think that also understanding AI can be a wonderful something to harness very positively, but how it also impacts on the post-pandemic issues as well. There continues to be a growing student mental health concern. We knew we had it in universities before the pandemic. It certainly rose during the pandemic, and it continues to rise. And again, thinking that when we're thinking about pandemic and post-pandemic issues and the new normal, to note also the impact of social media and how social media is now impacting on learners, particularly from their sort of 7, 8, 9 years of age up right into universities, and a considerable worry about young females in particular. I think the thing that struck me in reading the chapters and also in reading the research was that the readiness of schools of education to respond. And there's a lovely piece of research that says the two disciplines that were really ready for the pandemic were schools of computer science and schools of education. And it was schools of biology and schools of law that were the least stable. But how that really, you were not only ready educationally, you were ready. Technically, you were also ready in terms of how you knew how to work with each other and with your learners. The implications is I really urge you to continue to read the post-pandemic research as it emerges. And I've seen research coming out in the last 6 months that I think is very important. And I think as more and more research, as we get more time, a greater passage of time happens between the end of the pandemic and where we are now, just watch what's happening in terms of the research, and particularly on some of the issues on online learning and the levels of learning that can be achieved through online learning. And also to remember what you were good at, to remember what's come through in all these chapters of the really fine, how well schools of education were able to cope, and how that really central position. I know you've talked about resilience and grit, and your previous book on resilience is very fine in that regard. But I think, and thanks for Nadine in Johannesburg, that I learned the word Ubuntu. That sense of togetherness, that sense of community, and that really to know what you did well in the pandemic, because as we move through whatever the next crisis is going to be, that's what's going to get you through it. The togetherness you've had in this research, the real high quality of the chapters in this book, but that sense of community, that sense of Ubuntu is very fine. And I just leave you with the important message again from Antonio Guterres. We must reimagine education systems and raise the status of education. We must ensure that learning empowers individuals and societies to both reshape the present and lead us to a more just, sustainable, resilient and peaceful future. This book has gone a long way to helping our understanding of that. It's been my pleasure to contribute to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, as expected, Professor Redmond, you're kind of closing us up in the book, and today is, yeah, it's a really powerful quote. So thank you. So we already have a lot of questions, which is great. We can of course anyone can sort of take them and add on, but I thought that maybe we could have a couple of folks lead us in a few questions. So Professor Petersen, I think you responded via the chat, but do you want to say anything about the maybe extra or other challenges that your institution, your school of education faced, and how you overcame them?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have responded a little bit in the chat, but some of the things we struggled with, for instance, were how do we, in an online environment, knowing full well that many of our students didn't have the data to enable their learning. This wasn't just for University of Johannesburg students, but students at less resourced institutions. So this was a massive thing. And we needed to find ways in which we could limit the number, the difficulty students had with very limited data. And so we used the ICT experts and expertise we had in our faculty particularly, and we developed guidelines for reducing data use. We did that in the form of guidelines for lecturers to upload and what would the expectations would be for students. I'm not an ICT expert, so I wouldn't be able to give you the detail, but that was one of the things. But also how we could make navigation for our students much easier, so that we developed a template that we asked all lecturers to use. And I know one of the big things that came up was you infringing on my academic autonomy here, but it wasn't at that point we had to manage conversations. It actually wasn't about that. It was about, we don't want students to get online and then have to find in 3 different courses or 6 different courses. We must look for information in different places. And I think once we had those critical conversations, staff understood and we could then roll it out. And so we shared that within our faculty, within the bigger university, but we also shared it outside of UJ through our Directorate of Teacher Education, because we found that while we had the expertise to develop some of these guidelines, other institutions, less resourced institutions, did not. So we made this available for sharing in the wider education community, and that helped to kind of close the gap somewhat between institutions that had the expertise and resources and others that didn't. I hope that addresses. So it was around ICT, it was around assessments. What were the plans when students couldn't go into schools? What kind of plans would we put into place to ensure that they still got some numbers of teacher practice in different settings, and we shared those plans very widely. So I hope that addresses the question. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. Marian, do you want to take this one? Because I think you spoke to this earlier, and I can go back to your slide. So can you provide an overview of the types of HEIs involved in the project and the significance of the U21 Global Network?
Sure. Thanks, Priya. So the U21, the Universitas 21 is a global network that brings together about 29 research-intensive universities who share a common belief in the value of collaboration and internationalization. So these 29 institutions are located all over the world, in Asia, in Europe, in South Africa, in South America, and North America as well. But not all U21 institutions have a school of education. The National University of Singapore, for instance, doesn't have a school of education. So this particular network, the U21 Deans of Education, is another group within U21 that consists of Deans of Education, where there are a faculty or school of education. So in the last 24 years or so, the Deans of Schools of Education have met, typically annually, sometimes twice a year, at some of the education conferences, typically at the American Educational Research Association conference. So they've been meeting for over 20 years to discuss issues and challenges that they go through even before the pandemic, and sharing resources and collaborate on projects and issues that they feel were pertinent and important at the time. So within the Universitas 21 Deans of Education, there are, I can't remember the numbers now, but we sought expressions of interest from the schools of education to contribute a chapter manuscript in this book, and 10 of the schools of education responded to the call at that point of time. And within the U21 Deans of Education group, we also have what we call the Forum for International Networking in Education. The Forum for International Networking in Education started out as a group of graduate students who typically go to some of these conferences, but were isolated. So they came together to collaborate, to network, and it became under the auspice of the U21 Deans of Education group to provide them some of the support financially and also intellectually. The Forum for International Networking in Education was expanded to include early career academics. And for the last, since 2007, the Forum for International Networking in Education has been organizing an annual forum as well for their graduate researchers and early career academics. Obviously, it was harder to meet during the pandemic. So both groups collectively have been meeting online twice or 3 times a year. And the Forum for International Networking in Education specifically has been running all these webinars for graduate researchers and early career academics on issues that were pertinent to them. So despite the pandemic, collectively as a group, we've came together, we've shared, and and what the book is one of the outcomes of this collective collaboration. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to actually stop the share. so we can see each other's faces a bit better. So can I scroll up here to a little bit about kind of, learning recommendations? I wonder if Professors Watterston and Neuhaus would like to take this one. So how can higher education and schools of education benefit from or use the insights and recommendations in this volume? I thought maybe both of you in your roles as, heads, deans, you might actually have be inspired. You want to start us?
I'm happy for you to go first, Sinikka.
Okay, I don't know if I can inspire, but the words that I took notes during the presentations, and the words redefine, a very academic word, I would say, rethink, more also an academic word, but also more about a vision, and reimagine, that is also about a strong vision about education. I think these words are really, really important. And I liked how the vulnerability and uncertainty came in, because it's almost like a paradox that we learned that our superpower within education is actually dealing with uncertainty. So I think that these words, redefining, rethinking, reimagining, could actually help us in understanding in a deeper way, learning in a deeper way. And what we need to learn is actually that we are in this together. We are linked as humans within education, and we should always try to come back to that vision. But yeah, so that's my...
Okay, well, from my perspective, I just need to start this by saying I've never worked in higher education until I became a dean 7 years ago. So I worked in school systems and led, some large states in Australia. So from my perspective, the question really talks about what could we do within teacher education and to respond to government policy and advocate for, those kind of things. And so for me, the reason I wanted to be in this job was to help translate education outcomes and thinking around good practice, and be able to sort of deliver that to teachers who are time poor. And what we saw during COVID was that people were really time poor, and they were stretched, and they worked incredibly well and hard, but we certainly didn't get the same outcomes that we were getting previously. And so I think there's a real role, and certainly I talk about this with our faculty all the time, about what we can do to create better resources for schools to be able to focus on those 6 things that I talked about during the presentation. And also because I've led school systems, some large school systems, 1,600 schools or whatever, I know that school systems do the best they can, and they make sure that everyone's safe and they follow policies and things, but it's very hard to innovate and build practice in school systems. And so that's a job that really could be supported and led by universities, by faculties of education. And again, we talk a lot about this in Victoria, about what should we be doing to assist teachers to be able to move forward with students and personalised learning and all those things that we talk about, which seem very casual and easy to understand when you're talking about them in a forum or when you're discussing something like we are tonight. But when it comes down to getting the rubber on the road and teachers actually personalising learning, what does that look like? How can they do it? And so every faculty in the world is trying to do that for schools, but I don't think we're having the impact that we need to, and certainly not in Victoria. So we do need to make sure that what we're doing is translatable, and it's assisting people to be able to be architects of their own improvement within their own classrooms.
Okay, super. I think there was a question about how does this volume address structural and conceptual shifts in several areas? John had given some response. John, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I can do that briefly. I was sort of thinking about the collective set of chapters, and I think taken as a whole, they really do offer new ideas about structure, but also about research. And so there's chapters that explore new initiatives for recruiting pre-service teachers. There's chapters that explore how schools of education responded to regulated policies surrounding the pandemic and advocated for more sort of thoughtful policy. There's chapters that explore physical design and organization of buildings within schools of education. There's chapters that explore these questions that schools were asking about their students and how their students were navigating. And so there's a little bit of all of that around the structure, around the research, around teaching and learning. And I think it's all sort of framed within, you know, to talk about the other question there around case studies and narrative reflections. That's one of the things that we as an editorial team asked each of the authors to provide, is a bit of a narrative reflection on their own context and a bit of sort of, okay, so this is what's happening in your context. These are the questions you're asking. These are the things that are happening, but also like, how's it going, right? And so I think readers of the volume will walk away both with you know, with a new understanding of like, what is the scope of leadership, research, and teaching and learning, but also how did that affect people on a personal and human level? And so I think that hopefully the volume leads to continued discussions around both of those things, the need for new policies and new approaches, but also the need for these really human spaces.
Thanks, John. We are out of time, but does anyone have any last question? Anything you really want to know before we sign off?
Perhaps I'd like to say, just as a representative of Universitas 21, how proud the network is of this group. As Marian said, it's a very old, Universitas 21 is 27 years old this year, and how really the work of this group has grown. And I've seen Marian Mahat from a postdoc to a very important, far more senior academic now, and that growth in the institutions. And I know there's a question that, and it's a fair point, that Universitas 21 represents very well-resourced universities. But it's also the learning from our universities and how they can be, in books like this, and how they can help really shine light into other areas. But yes, on behalf of U21, to say we're very proud of this group, very proud of the publications you've produced, and keep on going with it, really.
Thank you so much. It's great to end on a positive note. Yeah, just more gratitude. Thank you again to Chera and Cirque for hosting us today. I think, you know, John, Smridhi, and I are early career, and so we really want to thank the deans, the senior scholars, Marian for mentoring us, for teaching us, for supporting us in our kind of first book editorship experience. It was really, really phenomenal. Working with you all, working with Emerald has been a really incredible learning opportunity. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. I think there might be a minimum of 10 time zones here. So clearly part of the new normal is waking up early and late, waking up early and staying up late. So no, really, thank you. And then as Marian Mahat said, we will send the registrants a discount link for the book purchase. And then we do have some more upcoming seminars sponsored by Chera here in the chat as well. So thank you, really appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the book. The link I put there has the abstracts. Please feel free to reach out to any of the contributors. I'm sure all of us would be happy to talk further about, yeah, building a better normal together. Thanks, everyone. It should be Monday for all of us, so make it a great week and see you soon.
Thanks, Priya.
Thank you.
Thanks, Priya.
Thank you.